The Tragic Legend of Reconstruction by Kenneth M. Stampp. Kenneth Stampp was a professor of American history at the University of California, Berkeley, and a specialist on the Civil War. This present piece is part of his book, The Era of Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877. When the historian reaches the year 1865, he must take leave of the war and turn to another epoch, Reconstruction, when the task was, in Lincoln's words, to bind up the nation's wounds and to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace. A synopsis of the Dunning School's version of Reconstruction would run something like this. Abraham Lincoln, while the Civil War was still in progress, turned his thoughts to the great problem of reconciliation, and, with malice toward none and charity for all, this gentle and compassionate man devised a plan that would restore the South to the Union with minimum humiliation and maximum speed. But there had already emerged in Congress a faction of radical Republicans, sometimes called Jacobins or Vindictives, who sought to defeat Lincoln's generous program. Motivated by hatred of the South, by selfish political ambitions, and by crass economic interests, the radicals tried to make the process of Reconstruction as humiliating, as difficult, and as prolonged as they possibly could. Until Lincoln's tragic death, they poured their scorn upon him, and then used his coffin as a political stump to arouse the passions of the Northern electorate. In the spring of 1877, the tragic era finally came to an end when President Hayes withdrew the federal troops from the South and restored home rule. But the legacy of radical Reconstruction remained in the form of a solidly democratic South and embittered relations between the races. What is perhaps most puzzling in the legend of Reconstruction is the notion that the white people of the South were treated with unprecedented brutality, that their conquerors literally put them to the torture. How, in fact, were they treated after the failure of their rebellion against the authority of the federal government? The great mass of ordinary Southerners who voluntarily took up arms or in other ways supported the Confederacy were required simply to take an oath of allegiance to obtain pardon and to regain their right to vote and hold public office. But what of the Confederate leaders? The men who held high civil offices, often after resigning similar federal offices, the military leaders who had graduated from West Point and had resigned commissions in the United States Army to take commissions in the Confederate Army. Were there mass arrests, indictments for treason or conspiracy, trials and convictions, executions or imprisonments? Nothing of the sort. Officers of the Confederate Army were paroled and sent home with their men. After surrendering at Appomattox, General Lee bade farewell to his troops and rode home to live his remaining years undisturbed. What, then, constituted the alleged brutality that white Southerners endured? First, the freeing of their slaves. Second, the brief incarceration of a few Confederate leaders. Third, a political disability imposed for a few years on most Confederate leaders. Fourth, a relatively weak military occupation terminated in 1877. And last, an attempt to extend the rights and privileges of citizenship to Southern Negroes. Mistakes there were in the implementation of these measures, some of them serious, but brutality, almost none. In fact, it can be said that rarely in history have the participants in an unsuccessful rebellion endured penalties as mild as those Congress imposed upon the people of the South, and particularly upon their leaders. After 4 years of bitter struggle costing hundreds of thousands of lives, the generosity of the federal government's terms was quite remarkable. If Northern brutality is a myth, the scandals of the Grant administration and the peculations of some of the Southern Reconstruction governments are sordid facts. They make corruption a central theme of their narratives, but they overlook constructive accomplishments. They give insufficient attention to the men who transcended the greed of an age when, to be sure, self-serving politicians and irresponsible entrepreneurs were all too plentiful. Among these men were the humanitarians who organized freedmen's aid societies to help 4 million Southern Negroes make the difficult transition from slavery to freedom, and the missionaries and teachers who went into the South on slender budgets to build churches and schools for the freed men. Under their auspices, the Negroes first began to learn the responsibilities and obligations of freedom. Thus, the training of Negroes for citizenship had its successful beginnings in the years of Reconstruction. In the 19th century, most white Americans, North and South, had reservations about the Negroes' potentialities. Radical idealism was in part responsible for two of the most momentous enactments of the Reconstruction years: the 14th Amendment to the Federal Constitution, which gave Negroes citizenship and promised them equal protection of the laws, and the 15th Amendment, which gave them the right to vote. The fact that these amendments could not have been adopted under any other circumstances or at any other time, before or since, may suggest the crucial importance of the Reconstruction era in American history. Indeed, without radical Reconstruction, it would be impossible to this day for the federal government to protect Negroes from legal and political discrimination. White Americans had an ambivalent attitude toward race and toward the steps that radical Republicans took to protect the Negroes. Southern white men accepted the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery, with a minimum of complaint, but they expected federal intervention to proceed no further than that. They assumed that the regulation of the freed men would be left to the individual states, and clearly most of them intended to replace slavery with a caste system that would keep the Negroes perpetually subordinate to the whites. Negroes were to remain a dependent laboring class. They were to be governed by a separate code of laws. They were to play no active part in the South's political life, and they were to be segregated socially. When radical Republicans used federal power to interfere in these matters, the majority of Southern white men formed a resistance movement to fight the radical-dominated state governments until they were overthrown, after which Southern whites established a caste system in defiance of federal statutes and constitutional amendments. For many decades thereafter, the federal government simply admitted defeat and acquiesced. But the South refused to forget or forgive those years of humiliation when Negroes came close to winning equality. In Southern mythology, then, Reconstruction was a horrid nightmare. As for the majority of Northern white men, it's hard to tell how deeply they were concerned about the welfare of the American Negro after the abolition of slavery. If one were to judge from the way they treated the small number of free Negroes who resided in the northern states, one might conclude that they were at best indifferent to the problem, and that a considerable number of them shared the racial attitudes of the South and preferred to keep Negroes in a subordinate caste. The vogue of social Darwinism discouraged governmental intervention in behalf of Negroes as well as other underprivileged groups. It encouraged the belief that a solution to the race problem could only evolve slowly as the Negroes gradually improved themselves. A rising spirit of nationalism stimulated a desire for sectional reconciliation, and part of the price was a virtual abdication of federal responsibility for the protection of the Negro's civil and political rights. In New England, however, there appeared early in the 20th century a wave of sentimentalism, which at that time took up the cause of the Negro, and in so doing apparently destroyed, to a large extent, pride and consciousness of race in the North. The agitation over slavery was inimical to the Nordic race because it thrust aside all national opposition to the intrusion of hordes of immigrants of inferior racial value and prevented the fixing of a definite American type. The legend of Reconstruction has had serious consequences because it has exerted a powerful influence upon the political behavior of many white men, North and South.